An uneasy arrival. Na brushed her fingers over the smooth fabric of her dress, the teal color a striking contrast against her deep, warm skin tone. She adjusted the delicate gold necklace resting at her collarbone, drawing in a steadying breath as she studied her reflection in the mirror. Tonight was another dinner at her mother-in-law Margaret's, and her stomach twisted with a familiar pang of anxiety. As the wife of Michael Caldwell, she had quickly learned that marrying him meant also marrying into his family's traditions and expectations. But tonight felt different, like an intangible shift in the atmosphere that Na couldn't ignore. Just then, Michael's voice called from downstairs, breaking her thoughts. "Babe, you ready?" "Coming," she replied, giving herself one last glance in the mirror. Her tight, dark curls framed her face perfectly, and her simple dress complemented her figure without drawing too much attention. She looked beautiful, strong, but she couldn't help wondering if she would ever look like enough in Margaret's eyes. When she descended the stairs, Michael's eyes lit up, his warm brown gaze softening as he took her in. "You look incredible," he murmured, placing a gentle kiss on her cheek. She smiled back at him, feeling her love for him surge as she took his arm. "Thank you. Let's go before we're late. Can't keep your mom waiting." They made the short drive to Margaret Caldwell's grand home, its stately white facade looming under the evening sky, edged in darkness that only heightened the opulent image. Michael held her hand, squeezing it gently, oblivious to the tense set of her shoulders. Na appreciated his efforts to include her in every family gathering, but she could tell he didn't notice the subtle glances or icy remarks from his mother and Margaret's close friend Sarah. They pulled up, and before Michael could even knock, the door swung open to reveal Margaret. She looked as though she had been waiting for them. "Michael, my darling," she exclaimed, pulling him into a tight embrace. Her eyes drifted to Na with a polished smile, void of warmth. "Na, dear," she said, her tone cool, "you look well. I hope you're feeling better after the last dinner. I was worried you might have a sensitive stomach." Na's smile wavered but stayed intact. "Thank you, Margaret. I'm doing just fine." They stepped inside, and Na felt the weight of the Caldwell mansion's elegant grandeur pressing down on her. Everything seemed to gleam with purpose, from the glistening chandeliers overhead to the polished floors beneath. Margaret led them to the lavish dining room, and there, waiting, was Sarah, looking immaculate as always, tall, blonde, with flawless skin and a ready, serene smile. Sarah was the quintessential match Margaret had envisioned for Michael since they were teenagers. "Na," Sarah said, her tone sickly sweet. "So good to see you. I hope you'll try Margaret's cooking tonight. She's outdone herself, as usual." Na tried not to let her discomfort show. "I'm sure it'll be wonderful," she replied, keeping her voice polite but distant. As Sarah moved in to chat with Michael, Margaret motioned for Na to join her in the kitchen, her tone making it clear it wasn't a request. Michael had already drifted into conversation with Sarah, oblivious to Na's unease. "Let's put you to work, dear," Margaret said, her voice edged with a pointed determination. As soon as they were alone, her demeanor shifted, a subtle hardness overtaking her expression. "I'm sure you won't mind helping me set the table," she said, handing her a tray of fine silverware. "Of course," Na replied, hoping her nervousness didn't show. As she set the table, Margaret's quiet, judging gaze bore into her. "I hope you appreciate the effort I put into these family dinners, Na," Margaret said, her voice deceptively soft. "Our family has traditions, standards, and I trust you're doing your best to rise to them." The underlying meaning was unmistakable. Na swallowed back the sting of her words. "I'm honored to be here, Margaret. I want nothing more than for us to get along and enjoy each other's company." Margaret's polite smile barely concealed her disinterest. "Well, let's just say I have certain expectations for anyone joining our family," she replied. Her voice softened with Fox's concern as she added, "especially someone from, well, a different background. You understand, I'm sure." The comment hit harder than Na wanted to admit, but she held her composure, unwilling to let Margaret see her hurt. She had grown up knowing how to navigate these prejudiced waters, familiar with the double standards and the quiet biases that people like Margaret hid behind polished smiles and feigned civility. As they returned to the dining room, Na forced herself to ignore the growing tension that clawed at her stomach. Michael looked up and smiled, patting the seat beside him, but Margaret quickly moved in, seating Sarah beside Michael and guiding Na to a seat at the far end of the table. "Just a small adjustment," Margaret cooed with a quick, dismissive smile. "Sarah, dear, you can sit here next to Michael. I'm sure Na won't mind a bit of rearranging." Na clenched her jaw, but kept her smile fixed as she took her seat. Dinner began with the familiar pleasantries, and the conversation flowed around her, punctuated by Margaret's lively anecdotes about her travels and the Caldwell legacy. She saw how the other family members' eyes sparkled with admiration and felt her own presence sink further into the background. Every time Na tried to contribute to the conversation, Margaret swiftly shifted the topic, steering the attention back to Sarah or Michael, or offering a subtle reminder of Na's supposed different background. Sarah, for her part, seemed to bask in the attention, leaning in close to Michael as she recounted shared memories of their high school days, filling the table with her easy laughter. As the main course was served, Na noted a small, peculiar difference in her plate. The food was delicious as always, but the texture was slightly off, and the aftertaste lingered in an unpleasant way. She took a cautious bite, feeling her stomach twist with nausea. As she put down her fork, Margaret noticed and leaned forward with a concerned look. "Dear, is something wrong? You look pale. Perhaps the dish is too rich for your stomach." Michael turned to her, his brows creased in concern. "Are you feeling okay?" "Yes, of course, I'm fine," Na replied quickly, brushing off the growing sickness. But her stomach continued to churn, and it wasn't long before she felt a wave of dizziness. She stood abruptly, excusing herself from the table as she made her way to the bathroom, her face turning pale in the mirror's reflection. As she rinsed her mouth and steadied herself against the sink, her mind raced. This wasn't the first time she had fallen ill after dinner at the Caldwells, and an unsettling pattern was beginning to form. She wondered if her unease was just in her head, or if there was a more sinister reason for her frequent illnesses. When she returned to the dining room, she found Margaret smiling warmly at her with barely hidden satisfaction, while Michael looked at her with concern. "Maybe we should go home early, babe," Michael said, wrapping a comforting arm around her shoulders. "You look really pale." Na offered a faint smile. "Maybe just a bit too much rich food," she said, avoiding Margaret's gaze as she leaned into Michael for support. "Do get some rest, dear," Margaret chimed, her voice a bit too sweet. "We'll have to try this again sometime when you're feeling better. I'm sure you wouldn't want to miss out on our family traditions." Na felt a chill run down her spine at Margaret's words, the underlying menace lurking beneath her polite tone. As they left, a wave of resolve began to build within her. She would not let Margaret's subtle slights and veiled attacks undermine her marriage to Michael. But even as she made that silent vow, she had no idea of the challenges that lay ahead. Challenges that would force her to confront a truth darker than she could ever have imagined. This was only the beginning. Seeds of suspicion. The 2 weeks following that tense dinner felt like a reprieve for Na, but also a prelude to something greater. Michael didn't sense the storm brewing under the surface, though she knew she had to make him see it. He loved his family, and that love was a comfort to him, one that Na didn't want to shatter. But Margaret's gaze lingered in Na's mind. The words she chose to say, and the unspoken ones glinting behind her polite mask. One evening, as she and Michael relaxed on the couch, he glanced up from the magazine he was flipping through. "Mom called earlier today," he said casually. "She's inviting us to dinner this weekend." Na's stomach twisted involuntarily, but she masked it with a light smile. "She's certainly enthusiastic about hosting dinners." "Yeah, she's always been that way." Michael chuckled, his voice soft with nostalgia. Growing up, She'd host family dinners every Sunday without fail. It was her way of keeping the family close. Na forced herself to hold her tongue, not wanting to intrude on his memory. But something didn't sit right. Every dinner ended with her feeling ill. How much longer could she pretend it was a coincidence? The sickness after each meal, the look Margaret gave her, the way Sarah effortlessly took her place beside Michael. She couldn't ignore the signs any longer. "Michael," she began carefully, "have you ever noticed? I mean, don't you think it's a little odd that I keep getting sick after every dinner at your mom's?" Michael frowned slightly, his expression one of mild concern. "Maybe it's just something in her cooking that doesn't sit well with you. It could be a spice, or even the richness of the food. You know how elaborate Mom can be with her recipes." She nodded but pressed on. "Maybe. But I was thinking, what if it's more than that?" He looked at her, a hint of confusion in his warm brown eyes. "What do you mean?" Na hesitated, unsure of how to voice her suspicions without sounding paranoid. "It just feels strange. Like maybe it's not the food itself, but something more intentional. I don't know. Maybe I'm just being overly cautious, but I can't shake the feeling." Michael laughed softly, dismissing her concerns with a wave of his hand. "Nah, you're overthinking it. Mom might be a little set in her ways, but she would never do anything to hurt you. She's a bit old-fashioned, that's all." Na bit back her frustration, swallowing down her doubts for the moment. Michael's loyalty to his family was one of the reasons she loved him, but it was blinding him to the truth. As the weekend approached, Na grew increasingly anxious. Her friend Jasmine had been right. She needed proof. The only way Michael would ever believe her was if she could show him that Margaret's intentions weren't as innocent as they seemed. On the day of the dinner, Na decided to prepare. She whipped up her own dish, an herb-stuffed chicken casserole, and packed it carefully in her own container. "I just thought I'd contribute," she told Michael when he raised his eyebrows. He grinned, oblivious to her true motives. "Mom will love it. She's always talking about how much she enjoys sharing recipes. Maybe this will help break the ice." Na smiled weakly, but her heart pounded with nerves. She wasn't trying to bond with Margaret, not after everything she'd experienced. She was trying to survive this dinner and find out the truth. When they arrived at the Caldwell mansion, Margaret was there to greet them, her hair in its usual flawless chignon, her expression a portrait of polite civility. Her gaze flitted to the casserole dish in Na's hands, and her smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "Oh, how lovely," Margaret said, her voice saccharine sweet. "You didn't need to bring anything, Na. I've prepared a special meal just for you." Na's pulse quickened, but she kept her voice calm. "I just thought it would be nice to share something from my own kitchen." Margaret's smile didn't reach her eyes. "How thoughtful of you, dear." Inside, Sarah was already lounging on the velvet sofa, perfectly poised and looking as if she belonged there more than Na ever would. "Na, so glad you could make it," she called, patting the seat beside her as Michael went off to greet his father. Sarah's presence was as irksome as ever, and it was hard not to feel displaced as she laughed with Michael, regaling him with some story about her recent work with the local charity. Margaret seemed to beam with pride at each of Sarah's accomplishments, only offering Na a distant nod when she attempted to join the conversation. When it was finally time for dinner, Na noticed Margaret had arranged the seating so that Sarah was beside Michael again, while Na was placed at the far end of the table. It was as if Margaret was deliberately creating physical space between her and her husband, a detail that didn't go unnoticed. But Na had come prepared. She waited until everyone was seated before casually sliding her own casserole dish onto her plate, dishing up a generous serving for herself. Margaret noticed and frowned slightly, but her mask slipped back into place almost immediately. The meal progressed, and Na watched Margaret closely as she ate, noting the way her mother-in-law's gaze flicked between her and her own untouched plate. As Na finished her portion of the casserole, she felt fine. Better than fine, actually. Meanwhile, Margaret's watchful expression seemed to darken, as if frustrated by her continued health. The unease grew as dessert was brought out. Na's plate contained a slice of chocolate cake, which looked slightly darker and heavier than the slices served to Michael and the others. Trying not to let her apprehension show, she took a small bite, her mind racing as the familiar bitter aftertaste lingered on her tongue. Within minutes, the nausea began to churn, sharp and immediate. Na forced herself to remain composed, but she couldn't ignore the wave of dizziness that followed. The bile rose in her throat, and she excused herself, barely making it to the restroom in time. As she leaned over the sink, splashing cold water on her face, the reality began to crystallize in her mind. This wasn't just coincidence. There was something in the food that only she was consuming, something Margaret was adding, knowing it would make her ill. The thought filled her with a mix of dread and determination. She would not be a passive victim in this silent war Margaret was waging against her. If she had to, she would gather evidence, something Michael could see for himself. She composed herself and returned to the dining room, her face pale but set with newfound resolve. Michael looked up, concern flooding his eyes. "Babe, you're pale again. Maybe it's time to head home." "Perhaps you should," Margaret agreed, her tone almost triumphant. "It would be best for you to rest." Na forced a polite smile. "Yes, that might be best. I'll feel better in my own space." But her thoughts were racing, plotting her next steps. This would not be the end of her silent suffering. As they left, she felt Margaret's gaze on her back, sharp and victorious, as if daring her to say something. But Na kept her head high, determined to find a way to prove the truth. The drive home was quiet, Michael's brow furrowed as he glanced at her worriedly. "Are you sure you're okay?" he asked for the third time. "I'm fine," she replied, her voice steady. But inside, her heart was anything but calm. She had a mission now, and she would see it through, no matter the cost. The next day, she called Jasmine, her best friend since childhood. "Jazz, I need your help," she said, her voice hushed. "What's going on, girl?" Jasmine asked, her tone immediately concerned. Na explained everything. The sickness after each meal, Margaret's subtle manipulations, her suspicions that something in the food was causing her to fall ill. Jasmine listened intently, her anger palpable even over the phone. "This is messed up, Na," Jasmine said, her voice low. "You can't keep letting her get away with this. She's trying to undermine you, make you look weak in front of Michael. But you have to fight back." "I know," Na replied, taking a deep breath. "That's why I need proof. I need to figure out what she's doing so I can show Michael." Jasmine paused, then spoke with firm resolve. "Bring some samples next time. We'll get them tested. I have a friend who works in a lab. They could tell us if there's anything in the food that shouldn't be there." Na's pulse quickened with hope. "Really? That would be perfect." "Yes, and while we're at it, keep a journal. Every time you go over there, write down what you eat, how you feel, everything. Document it. That way, even if we don't find anything right away, you'll have something to show Michael." The plan gave Na a renewed sense of purpose, a way to regain control over the situation. She thanked Jasmine, feeling grateful for her friend's support. The next time she visited Margaret's, she would come prepared, not just with her casserole, but with her eyes wide open. Over the next few weeks, Na began keeping meticulous notes. Every dinner was a strategic operation, where she analyzed each dish, tasted cautiously, and excused herself at the first sign of nausea. She pocketed samples whenever possible, storing them carefully to be tested later. Each time she returned home, she noted the symptoms, the timing, and the lingering bitterness that seemed to follow Margaret's dishes. She had almost completed her documentation when, at another dinner, Margaret brought out a fresh batch of lasagna. This time, however, Na made a point of switching her plate with Michael's when Margaret wasn't looking. The result was almost immediate. As Michael ate, Na watched him carefully, and soon she saw the same signs she'd experienced herself: paleness, sweating, the hint of nausea. Michael put his fork down, confusion clouding his face. I don't feel so good. Na leaned forward, her heart pounding. Michael, are you all right? His gaze shifted to hers, his face etched with discomfort. Maybe it's something in the lasagna, he said, his voice weak. I don't know. I've never felt like this before. As Margaret looked on, her face a mask of perfect innocence, Na felt a surge of triumph mingling with the horror of the realization that Michael was experiencing her silent torment firsthand. This was it, the proof she needed. Confrontation and revelation. Na's mind was racing as she helped Michael out of his chair, his face pale and clammy from the sudden wave of nausea. She knew this was no ordinary reaction to food. This was a direct consequence of Margaret's subtle and sinister attempts to manipulate their lives. As they made their way toward the front door, Na felt Margaret's gaze on her, a hint of cold satisfaction hiding beneath her practiced expression. Michael, darling, are you sure you don't want to stay and rest a bit? Margaret's voice followed them, syrupy sweet with a thin layer of concealed amusement. Michael shook his head, visibly uncomfortable. No, Mom. I think it's best if we go. I'm not feeling well at all. Margaret sighed, feigning sympathy. Very well, dear. Take care of yourself. Her eyes briefly met Na's with a hard glint, as if daring her to speak up, but Na remained silent, guiding Michael to their car, her heart pounding with a mix of triumph and dread. As soon as they were in the car, Michael closed his eyes and leaned his head back against the seat. I don't know what that was, Na. Maybe it was something in the food. I don't think I've ever felt this sick from a meal before. Na took a deep breath, steeling herself for what she was about to say. She'd waited so long for this moment, but now that it was here, she felt a mixture of apprehension and relief. Michael, she began softly, her voice steady. There's something I need to tell you. He opened his eyes, looking at her with curiosity mixed with concern. What is it? She hesitated, then continued. This isn't the first time I've felt sick after eating at your mother's house. In fact, it happens almost every time we're there. Michael's brows knitted together, his expression one of confusion. What are you saying? You think Mom's doing something to the food? Na nodded slowly, watching his reaction carefully. I know it sounds crazy, but I've been keeping notes. I've documented every time I've gotten sick, the dishes she served, and the symptoms. It's not a coincidence, Michael. I think your mother is intentionally making me ill. Michael stared at her, his face a mix of disbelief and discomfort. Nah, I don't even know what to say. That doesn't sound like my mom at all. She's a little old-fashioned, sure, but she would never intentionally hurt someone. Na took his hand, her voice gentle but insistent. Michael, I know how much you love your mother, but I need you to consider the possibility that she's not being entirely honest with us. Just tonight, I switched our plates without her knowing, and look what happened. You got sick instead of me. He pulled his hand away, rubbing his temples. Na, I just can't believe it. Why would she do that? Na felt a pang of sympathy for him. It was hard enough for her to accept that Margaret could be this manipulative, but for Michael, it was an even bigger blow. Margaret had always been his rock, his guiding figure. The idea that she could betray him like this was unimaginable. Michael, she said softly, I don't know why she's doing it, but I have a feeling it has something to do with Sarah. At the mention of Sarah, Michael's expression hardened slightly. He looked at her, his eyes troubled. Sarah, but she's just a friend. We grew up together. Mom might want us to stay close, but that doesn't mean she'd try to hurt you just because she likes Sarah. Na took a deep breath. It's more than that. Your mother has always made it clear that she thinks Sarah is a better match for you. I know you've heard her subtle comments, seen the way she positions Sarah next to you at every dinner, as if I'm not even there. Michael sighed, his face etched with exhaustion. I don't know. This is a lot to take in, Na. I need some time to process this. Na nodded, understanding the weight of what she had just laid on him. I get it. I know this is hard. But please, promise me you'll think about it. And if we go back, watch her carefully. You'll see what I've been seeing. Michael was silent for a long moment. Then he nodded slowly. Okay, I'll keep an open mind. But I need to hear her side too. Nah, I can't just believe that my own mother would do something so twisted. Relief washed over her, though she knew this was only the beginning. She planted the seed, but convincing Michael fully would take more than just words. Over the next few days, Michael remained quiet and withdrawn, clearly grappling with the new perspective Na had presented to him. Meanwhile, Na stayed in close contact with Jasmine, who had arranged for the samples they had taken to be tested. Jasmine reassured her, promising to call as soon as she had any news. Then one evening, as Na was finishing up dinner preparations at home, her phone buzzed with a message from Jasmine. She opened it, her heart racing, as she read the words on the screen. Na, we got the results. There was something in the food, something that shouldn't have been there. Call me ASAP. Na's hands trembled as she dialed Jasmine's number, her pulse pounding with a mixture of fear and validation. Jazz, she said as soon as her friend answered. Tell me everything. Jasmine's voice was grave. Na, the lab confirmed there were trace amounts of a compound that causes nausea and dizziness. It's subtle, but it's effective in low doses, especially when consumed over a period of time. Na felt a wave of anger and relief wash over her. So I wasn't imagining it. She really was doing something to me. Girl, this is serious, Jasmine said. You need to show this to Michael. He deserves to know exactly what's going on. Na thanked Jasmine and hung up, clutching her phone tightly as she prepared herself for the conversation she'd been waiting to have. That night, as they sat down to dinner, she slid the lab report across the table to Michael. What's this? He asked, picking it up and glancing at her, a hint of apprehension in his eyes. It's proof, she said quietly, her voice steady. Proof that there was something in the food. Jasmine had a friend test it, and they found traces of a compound that causes nausea. It was only in the samples I took from your mother's house. Michael's face went pale as he scanned the report, his hands shaking. Nah, this can't be real. There has to be some kind of mistake. She shook her head. I know it's hard to believe, but it's right there in black and white. Your mother has been deliberately making me sick, Michael. He looked up at her, his expression filled with confusion and pain. Why would she do this? I just don't understand. She's always been so loving. Na felt a pang of sympathy for him, but she knew she couldn't let him deny the truth any longer. Maybe we need to confront her, Michael. Maybe if you ask her directly, she'll tell you why. He hesitated, then nodded slowly, his face set with a new determination. You're right. We need to get to the bottom of this. The following weekend, Michael arranged for them to visit Margaret under the guise of a casual dinner, but this time they had a very different purpose. Na steeled herself as they drove to the Caldwell mansion, her mind racing with possible outcomes. She had no idea how Margaret would react, but she was determined to face her, to stand her ground and finally put an end to the silent war Margaret had waged against her. As they entered the house, Margaret greeted them with her usual poised smile, but Na could sense the tension beneath her calm exterior. She knew something was off, but she couldn't pinpoint exactly what it was. When they sat down in the living room, Michael wasted no time. Mom, there's something I need to talk to you about. Something serious. Margaret's smile faltered, a hint of worry flashing in her eyes. Of course, dear. What's on your mind? Michael took a deep breath, his gaze steady. Mom, Na's been feeling sick after every meal here, and we've discovered that it's not just a coincidence. We had some of the food tested, and it came back with traces of a compound that causes nausea and dizziness. Margaret's face froze, her hands clenched in her lap. For a moment, she didn't speak, her eyes darting between Michael and Na as if calculating her next move. Finally, she spoke, her voice calm but cold. Michael, I don't know what you're talking about. Are you suggesting that I would intentionally harm Na? Michael looked at her, his face filled with pain. Mom, we have proof. The samples we took from the food here were positive for that compound. Why would you do this? Margaret's composure began to crack, and a flicker of anger crossed her face. Michael, I've always had your best interests at heart. I've only ever wanted what's best for you. Na leaned forward, her voice firm. Margaret, this isn't about what's best for Michael. This is about you trying to control his life, about you trying to push me out so that you can have things your way. Margaret's eyes narrowed, and for the first time, Na saw the full force of the resentment she had harbored. You don't understand, Na. You don't belong in this family. Michael deserves someone who can match his background, his upbringing. Someone like Sarah. Michael's face contorted with shock and anger. Mom, you've crossed a line. Not as my wife. And I love her. She's more than enough for me. I can't believe you would go to these lengths just because you don't approve of her. Margaret's calm facade finally shattered, and she stood, her voice trembling with barely concealed rage. I have sacrificed everything for this family, Michael. I built this home, created a legacy, and I won't watch it crumble because of a mistake. Na doesn't fit in our world, and you'll see that sooner or later. Na felt a surge of anger rise within her, and she stood, meeting Margaret's gaze head-on. I may not have your wealth or your connections, Margaret, but I have something far more valuable. Michael's love. And I won't let you manipulate or hurt us just because I don't fit your idea of a perfect wife. Michael looked at his mother, his face filled with disappointment. Mom, I can't believe what I'm hearing. You've always taught me to stand up for the people I love, to be loyal and supportive. And now, you're the one who's betrayed that trust. Margaret's expression crumbled, a hint of regret seeping into her features. I only wanted what was best for you, Michael. Michael shook his head, his voice filled with resolve. Na is what's best for me. And if you can't accept that, then maybe we need to reconsider our relationship. Na felt a mixture of triumph and sadness as she looked at Michael, realizing that he was truly on her side. This confrontation had been painful, but it had finally exposed the truth. The bond she shared with Michael had been tested, but it had emerged stronger, unshakable in the face of Margaret's manipulation. As they walked out of the mansion that night, hand in hand, Na felt a weight lift from her shoulders. She knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but she and Michael were united, ready to face whatever came their way. Together, a shattered illusion. In the days following their confrontation with Margaret, Na and Michael struggled to process the fallout. It was as if the illusion they'd held of his family had shattered overnight, leaving nothing but the jagged remnants of what they once believed to be true. Margaret's actions had forced them to see her not just as a mother, but as a woman willing to harm others to achieve her goals. The realization was painful, especially for Michael, whose entire life had been shaped by his mother's influence. Na knew Michael was caught in the crossfire of love and betrayal, and though she was relieved to finally have him on her side, she couldn't ignore the toll it was taking on him. He grew quieter, often retreating into silence as he grappled with his feelings. She wanted to comfort him, but there was an unspoken barrier between them, as if they were both waiting for the other to process this immense betrayal on their own. One evening, Na found Michael sitting alone on their balcony, a half-empty glass of whiskey in his hand, staring out into the distance with a somber expression. She hesitated, then joined him, pulling a chair beside him and reaching for his hand. He gave her a faint smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. I don't even know who my mother is anymore, he murmured, swirling the whiskey in his glass. All my life, she's been my guide, my rock. And now, to think she could do something like this. Na squeezed his hand, her heart aching for him. I know it's hard to believe. I still can't fully wrap my head around it either. But Michael, this wasn't the spur-of-the-moment decision. She's been doing this for months, maybe longer. We can't ignore what she's done. He nodded, his face etched with pain. You're right, but it feels like I'm grieving. Like the mother I thought I knew never existed. I keep thinking back to all the times she supported me, told me to trust my instincts, to follow my heart. And now I see that the moment I chose you, she was willing to sabotage everything. Na leaned her head against his shoulder, feeling the weight of his despair. Sometimes the people who say they love us have their own fears and insecurities that twist their actions. She may love you in her way, but that doesn't excuse what she did. I don't think she fully realizes the damage she's caused. Michael's jaw tightened, and he set down his glass, turning to her with a look of quiet resolve. You're right. She doesn't. But she will. I've decided I'm going to confront her again, but this time on my own. I need answers, Na. I need to hear her try to justify this to me without hiding behind her resentment of you. Na looked at him, searching his face for any sign of hesitation, but there was none. Are you sure? She asked gently. I'll support you no matter what, but I don't want her to manipulate you again, to make you doubt yourself or your choices. He gave her a small, reassuring smile. Na, after everything we've been through, no one could make me doubt my choice to be with you. Not even my own mother. His gaze grew hard, steeled with determination. I need closure, Na, and I need her to know that she can't control me, that I'm not a pawn in her vision of our family. Na nodded, understanding his need for resolution. Then go. Just promise me you'll be careful. Margaret has a way of twisting things to suit her narrative. Don't let her make you feel guilty for choosing us. The next day, Michael arranged to meet Margaret at a small cafe, a public yet private setting where he hoped they could speak without interruption. He arrived early, settling himself at a corner table, and waited. As he watched the door, his mind raced with the questions he wanted to ask, but a deeper part of him feared the answers. Would she deny everything? Try to brush it off as some misguided attempt to protect him? When Margaret entered, she wore her usual air of composed elegance, her expression calm but guarded. She spotted Michael and offered a reserved smile as she approached, but there was a flicker of discomfort in her eyes as she sat down across from him. Michael, she said softly, reaching for his hand, but he pulled back, crossing his arms over his chest. Mom, he replied, his tone flat. Thank you for coming. I didn't want to do this over the phone. She looked at him, a touch of sadness in her gaze. Neither did I. He took a steadying breath, choosing his words carefully. I need to know why, Mom. Why would you go to such lengths to try to hurt Na? To hurt me? I need you to tell me the truth, and I need you to take responsibility. Margaret sighed, her calm exterior slipping as she pursed her lips, avoiding his gaze. Michael, it's not as simple as you think. When you married Na, I was worried. I was afraid she wouldn't fit in, that she wouldn't understand our family's values, our traditions. Values. Michael's voice rose, tinged with incredulity. What values could possibly justify poisoning my wife, lying to me, and manipulating our relationship? Margaret looked visibly shaken, but she held her ground. Michael, it wasn't meant to be harmful. I wanted her to see that maybe she wasn't the right fit for our family. And yes, I was hoping that maybe if she couldn't handle it, she'd realize that and step away. I thought I was protecting you. He stared at her, disgusted. Protecting me? You were protecting your own selfish image of what our family should be. Na never did anything to you, and yet you targeted her, made her feel unwelcome, and put her health at risk just to feed your own pride. Do you realize how twisted that sounds? Margaret's composure began to fracture, and her eyes grew misty. I did it out of love, Michael. I was afraid of losing you to someone who couldn't understand our world, who couldn't give you the kind of life you deserve. Michael clenched his fists, his voice low but full of anger. The kind of life I deserve is one I choose for myself. Na is my choice, and I don't need your approval to love her. You betrayed me, Mom. You poisoned the person I love most in this world. Do you even understand the depth of that betrayal? Tears spilled from Margaret's eyes, and she clasped her hands together, her voice choked with regret. Michael, I didn't know how to stop. I thought I could control the situation, but it spiraled out of my hands. I never meant to hurt you this way. Michael shook his head, his face hard. It's too late for apologies, Mom. I can't unsee what you've done. You put your pride above my happiness, and now I don't know if I can ever trust you again. The weight of his words hung heavily between them, the finality of it sinking into both of them like an icy wind. Margaret's shoulders slumped, and she nodded slowly, realizing the gravity of her actions and the price she would pay. Michael, she whispered, please, I know I've lost your trust, but I want to make it right. I'll do whatever it takes to rebuild our relationship, to earn back your faith in me. He looked away, unable to bear the pain etched on her face. I don't know if that's possible, Mom. This isn't something you can fix with an apology or good intentions. You crossed a line, and I don't think I can ever see you the same way again. They sat in silence for a long moment, the weight of their fractured relationship pressing down on them both. Margaret wiped her tears, trying to compose herself, but the regret in her eyes was unmistakable. She had lost something irreplaceable, a part of her son's trust that might never be restored. Michael rose to his feet, his face a mask of sorrow and resolve. I need some space, Mom. I need time to figure out what comes next. For now, I think it's best if we keep our distance. Margaret nodded, her voice barely a whisper. I understand. Just, please know that I'm sorry, and that I'll be here if you ever decide to give me a chance to make amends. Michael didn't respond, simply turning and walking away, leaving her sitting alone in the cafe, the shattered remnants of their relationship scattered between them. When Michael returned home, Na was waiting for him, her face etched with worry. He looked at her, his expression a mixture of exhaustion and sadness, and she knew the confrontation had taken a toll on him. She took his hand, leading him to the couch where they sat in silence, her hand rubbing gentle circles on his back as he processed the emotional weight of the day. She tried to justify it, he said finally, his voice hollow. She said she did it out of love, that she was trying to protect me. I can't believe I didn't see it sooner, Na. I feel like I've been lied to my whole life. Na hugged him tightly, her heart breaking for him. Michael, it's not your fault. People wear masks, even the ones we trust most. It's easy to believe the best in those we love. He looked at her, a spark of gratitude in his gaze. I don't know how you do it, Na. After everything she put you through, you're still here, supporting me. She gave him a soft smile, brushing a tear from his cheek. Because I love you, Michael, and because I know that we're stronger than this. Your mother's actions are her own, but you're your own person. We're in this together, and we'll get through it together. Michael nodded, pulling her close as he leaned his head against her shoulder, finding comfort in her warmth and presence. They sat together in silence, each feeling the scars of Margaret's betrayal, but united in their resolve to move forward. As the days turned into weeks, Na and Michael began the slow, painful process of healing, rebuilding the trust that Margaret had tried to destroy. They knew the road ahead would be challenging, but they were determined to face it together. No longer burdened by the weight of Margaret's manipulations, they had survived the storm, emerging stronger and more connected, ready to face whatever came next with a newfound resilience that Margaret could never break. Rebuilding and redefining. The weeks after Michael's confrontation with his mother passed slowly, each day bringing with it a mix of healing, introspection, and quiet resilience. Na and Michael were adjusting to a new reality, one without the looming shadow of Margaret's influence. Michael's decision to distance himself from his mother created a strange emptiness in their lives. Margaret had been a constant, sometimes overwhelming presence, and now, without her, they felt as if they were charting unknown waters. One Saturday morning, Na sat at the kitchen table, sipping her coffee as she reviewed her notes from their latest couples therapy session. Therapy had been challenging, forcing her to unpack the hurt and betrayal she'd endured. Michael was dealing with his own wounds, wrestling with the guilt of not seeing his mother's actions sooner and the grief of realizing how little he understood her. As she reread her notes, Michael entered the kitchen, his face looking brighter than it had in weeks. He leaned down to kiss her on the forehead, then sat across from her, his gaze intent. "I was thinking, maybe it's time we get away. Just us, somewhere quiet. I feel like we need a chance to breathe, to really leave everything behind for a little while." Her face lit up with excitement. "I'd love that, Michael. Honestly, I think it's exactly what we need." Within a week, they booked a small cabin in the mountains, far away from the city and all its complications. The cabin was nestled beside a crystal-clear lake, surrounded by trees that stood tall and unwavering, a stark contrast to the turbulence they'd been living through. The silence of the forest felt like a balm to their fractured hearts, a reminder that life could be peaceful and that love, once broken, could find a way to heal. The days were spent in simplicity, without the constant pull of obligations or the looming shadow of family. They'd wake early to the sound of birds, enjoying slow breakfasts by the lake, and then set off for hikes along winding forest trails, talking about everything and nothing. It was during one of these hikes that Michael finally opened up, speaking about things that had weighed heavily on his heart. He began, his voice soft. "I need to apologize again. I know I've said it before, but I don't think I can ever say it enough. I let you suffer, and I can't undo that. I didn't see what my mother was doing, and because of that, you bore the weight of her hate alone." Na stopped walking, turning to face him, her gaze steady. "Michael, I've already forgiven you. I know that if you'd known, you would have done something. You were raised to believe in your mother's love, to trust her implicitly. It's only natural that you wouldn't see the truth right away." He shook his head, a bitter smile playing on his lips. "But that's just it, Na. Love can blind us. I'm starting to see that now. It makes us ignore the ugly parts because we want to believe the best in people." He took her hands in his eyes searching hers. "But I don't want to be blind again. I want us to be honest, no matter how hard it is. No more hiding, no more pretending things are fine when they're not." Na's heart swelled at his words. "That's all I want too, Michael. I want us to be strong and to face everything together, even the hard parts." They stood there in the middle of the trail, surrounded by towering pines, feeling the weight of their words and the promise they held. In that moment, Na felt as though a part of their love had been reforged, stronger than before. It wasn't the easy, carefree love they'd shared in the early days of their relationship, but something deeper and more resilient, forged in the fires of betrayal and renewed by forgiveness. When they returned from the cabin, the world felt quieter. The chaos of their lives dimmed, but they knew their journey wasn't over. The distance Michael had put between himself and his mother felt like a necessary boundary, but it was clear that Margaret wasn't content to let things end there. A week after their return, Margaret reached out with an unexpected request. She wanted to meet with both of them, and this time, she insisted it would be with a therapist present. Her message was humble, almost pleading, and though they both had their doubts, they sensed an urgency they couldn't ignore. Michael read the message aloud, his face creased with uncertainty. "She says she's been in therapy and that she's ready to make amends," he murmured, more to himself than to Na. Na's chest tightened at the thought of facing Margaret again, but she knew Michael needed closure, and, in a strange way, so did she. "I think we should go," she said softly, meeting his gaze. "If she's really trying to change, maybe we can give her a chance to explain herself, but only if you're ready." Michael nodded, his expression one of cautious resolve. "I need to hear her out, Na. I need to know if she's really capable of change. For both our sakes." The day of the meeting arrived, and as they entered the therapist's office, Na felt a pang of anxiety twist in her stomach. Margaret was already seated, looking smaller and less put together than Na had ever seen her. She wasn't wearing her usual polished attire. Instead, she wore a simple sweater and slacks, her makeup minimal, as if she'd shed some of the armor that had always defined her. Margaret glanced up as they entered, her eyes softening at the sight of Michael. For a brief moment, Na felt a flicker of pity for her mother-in-law, who looked so vulnerable, so different from the woman who had ruled her family with an iron will. But she reminded herself of the hurt Margaret had caused and steeled herself, ready to listen but unwilling to excuse the past. The therapist, a warm, middle-aged woman named Dr. Hughes, began by introducing herself and setting the tone for the session. "Thank you all for being here," she said, her voice calm and measured. "Today is about creating a space for honesty, for accountability, and for the possibility of healing. Margaret, I know you requested this meeting, so perhaps you'd like to start." Margaret took a deep breath, her hands twisting in her lap as she searched for the right words. "Michael, Na, I want to start by saying how deeply sorry I am. I know my actions were unforgivable, and I know I hurt you both in ways I can never fully make up for. But I want you to know that I've been trying to understand myself, to understand why I did what I did. It's no excuse, but I grew up in a family that valued control, appearances, and status above everything else. I was taught to protect the family image at all costs." Her gaze drifted to Na, her expression filled with something akin to regret. "And when you came into our lives, Na, I saw you as a threat. Not because of anything you did, but because of my own insecurities. I felt like I was losing control, like I was losing my son to a world I didn't understand." Na's hands tightened around Michael's, but she forced herself to respond calmly. "So you tried to poison me, to drive me away. You let your fear justify hurting me, lying to your son." Margaret flinched, a flash of guilt crossing her face. I know how it sounds, and I don't expect you to forgive me, Na. I want you to understand that I was wrong, terribly wrong. My actions were fueled by fear, by this need to protect a legacy that, in the end, doesn't matter if I've lost my son's trust." Dr. Hughes leaned forward gently. "Margaret, recognizing our motivations is an important step, but it's only the beginning. What steps are you willing to take to rebuild the trust you've lost?" Margaret swallowed, nodding slowly. "I know I have a long way to go. I've committed to therapy, to working through my issues with control and letting go of the belief that I know what's best for everyone. I'm trying to change, to become someone who deserves to be in their lives. And I want to respect the boundaries you set, even if it means I'll never be able to make up for what I did." Michael's expression softened, and Na felt his hand tighten around hers, a silent show of support. He turned to her, his gaze filled with an unspoken question, as if he was seeking her guidance on how to respond. Na looked at Margaret, her heart torn between compassion and the scars of betrayal. "Margaret, I appreciate your words, and I can see you're trying. But trust isn't something that can be rebuilt overnight. I want to believe you've changed, that you're sincere, but this will take time, and we'll need to move forward at our own pace." Margaret nodded, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I understand, and I'm willing to do whatever it takes, no matter how long it takes. I want a chance to be a part of your lives again, even if it's only in a small way." The session continued with each of them sharing their feelings, the hurts and disappointments that had festered in silence for too long. Na felt her own pain lessen slightly with each word spoken, as if the act of verbalizing it allowed her to release a bit of the burden she'd carried. When the session ended, they stood to leave, each feeling a mixture of relief and lingering tension. Margaret looked at Michael and Na, her expression a strange blend of hope and acceptance. "Thank you for hearing me out," she whispered, her voice filled with genuine gratitude. "I know I have a long way to go, but I'll be here whenever you're ready." Michael nodded, his gaze softer than it had been in weeks. "We'll see, Mom. It'll take time. But I hope we can get there." Na and Michael walked out of the therapist's office hand in hand, feeling a newfound sense of unity and clarity. They knew that this was only the beginning of a journey toward healing, but for the first time, they felt like they had the strength to face it together. That evening, as they lay in bed, Na looked over at Michael, her heart swelling with love and pride. "We made it through today," she murmured, feeling the weight of their accomplishment. Michael smiled, pulling her close. "We did, and whatever happens next, I know we'll face it together. No more hiding, no more letting anyone come between us." As they drifted off to sleep, Na felt a renewed sense of hope. They were stronger now, not just as a couple but as individuals, fortified by the trials they'd endured. And though the path ahead was uncertain, they faced it with open hearts, ready to embrace whatever the future held. A new beginning and lasting change. In the months following their tense meeting with Margaret, life began to settle into a new rhythm for Na and Michael. Their lives, once clouded by the persistent tension of Margaret's interference, now felt brighter, freer. Na still felt occasional pangs of wariness. Her trust in Margaret remained fragile, and she knew it would take time before she could let her guard down. But with every step, she felt herself letting go of the past, allowing herself to envision a future shaped by love, strength, and unity. Their healing wasn't just a matter of moving forward. It required continuous, deliberate effort. Na and Michael leaned into their commitment to each other, rebuilding the trust that Margaret's actions had threatened. Therapy had become an integral part of their lives, helping them understand the underlying dynamics of their relationship and the family they were creating together. The once distant concept of boundaries had become a pillar of their love, a guide for the life they were determined to build on their own terms. It was on a crisp Saturday morning in late autumn that they received an unexpected message. Margaret was organizing a small family gathering at her home and had extended a cautious invitation to both of them. The words were tentative, written in Margaret's usual polished style, yet it was clear she'd put sincere thought into every line. "Michael, Na, if you feel comfortable, I would be honored to have you both over for dinner. It's been a while since we gathered as a family, and I'd love the chance to reconnect. There's no pressure. I respect whatever choice you make and understand if you're not ready. Thank you, regardless, for considering." Na read the message over Michael's shoulder, her stomach twisting with a mix of emotions. Part of her bristled at the idea of returning to the Caldwell mansion after everything that had happened there, but another part of her recognized the olive branch Margaret was offering. This wasn't the usual commanding, self-assured Margaret. It was a humble, tentative invitation, a request rather than a demand. Michael looked at her, his gaze soft but uncertain. "What do you think?" he asked, his tone hesitant. "It feels different this time, but I don't want to push you into anything you're not ready for." Na took a deep breath, considering her words carefully. I think we should go. If she's truly trying to change, then maybe this is a step toward healing. And even if it's just for one evening, I want to see for myself if she's capable of respecting us as a couple." Michael nodded, squeezing her hand. "Then we'll do this together. If anything feels off, we'll leave. No questions, no guilt." Na's heart swelled with gratitude, his support reminding her that they truly were united in this new chapter. On the evening of the dinner, Na chose her outfit carefully, wanting to strike a balance between grace and strength. She decided on a soft, emerald green dress with a simple silhouette, one that complemented her warm skin tone and framed her figure without drawing too much attention. She styled her curls to frame her face, letting her natural beauty shine without the need for adornment. This time, she was not seeking Margaret's approval. She was coming as herself, unapologetically. Michael looked at her with pride, his love evident in his gaze. "You look incredible," he whispered, pressing a gentle kiss to her forehead. "Ready to face whatever comes." She smiled, feeling the surge of courage. "Yes, together, we're ready." When they arrived at the Caldwell mansion, Na was surprised to find the atmosphere entirely different from past visits. Gone was the stiff formality, the carefully curated facade that Margaret had so meticulously maintained. Instead, the home felt softer, more inviting, as if it had shed some of its oppressive weight. Margaret herself greeted them at the door, her usual polished appearance softened by a warm, genuine smile. She looked at them both with a mixture of hope and caution, as if treading carefully around a fragile new beginning. "Nah, Michael," she greeted, her voice gentle and sincere. "Thank you for coming. It means more to me than I can say." Na offered a polite smile, sensing the authenticity in Margaret's tone. "Thank you for inviting us." As they entered, Na was surprised to see Robert, Michael's father, waiting in the living room. Robert had always been a quieter presence in the Caldwell family, a man who preferred to stay out of the family drama. He gave them a welcoming nod, his eyes softening as he looked at Na with a hint of gratitude. "It's good to see you both," he said, his tone warm. "Thank you for coming tonight." The dinner itself was simple yet elegant, a stark departure from the elaborate spreads Margaret used to pride herself on. The table was set with modest but tasteful china, and the meal was composed of home-style dishes rather than the complicated, extravagant courses that Margaret typically favored. It was as if Margaret had taken a step down from her usual pedestal, choosing warmth and sincerity over presentation. Conversation flowed more naturally than Na had expected. Margaret asked about Na's work, her interests, even inquired about her family. The questions felt genuine, and for the first time, Na sensed an openness in Margaret's demeanor. She wasn't trying to assert control or guide the conversation. She was genuinely listening. As they finished dinner, Margaret stood, her hands clasped in front of her, visibly gathering her courage. "Michael, Na, I want to thank you again for coming tonight. I know that I've done things, terrible things, that I can never fully atone for. But I want you to know that I am truly committed to changing, to becoming someone you both can trust again." Na met her gaze, her heart racing. "Margaret, I can see you're trying, and I appreciate that. I'm not saying it's easy, and I won't pretend that everything is magically fixed, but I respect that you're making an effort." Margaret nodded, her eyes glistening. "I understand, Na. I don't expect immediate forgiveness. I want to earn back some of the trust I lost. For you, for Michael, and for the family we all share." Michael took Na's hand under the table, his grip steady and reassuring. He looked at his mother, his voice filled with the quiet strength he found in the wake of their trials. "Mom, if you're willing to take accountability, then we're willing to try, but there are boundaries we'll need to establish. Na, and I come first. That's a line that can't be crossed again." Margaret nodded solemnly, her face etched with a mixture of regret and understanding. "I know. I won't let my insecurities get in the way of that again. Thank you both for giving me this chance." The rest of the evening passed peacefully, with laughter and conversation that felt refreshingly genuine. Na found herself relaxing, feeling a warmth she hadn't expected. It wasn't complete trust, but it was a step, a tentative bridge over the rift that Margaret had created. For the first time, Na sensed the possibility of a future in which they could coexist as family without the lingering weight of past grievances. In the weeks that followed, Margaret honored her commitment to respect their boundaries. She stopped by occasionally, bringing small, thoughtful gifts and offering to help with household projects, but never overstepping her bounds. She began to engage with Na on topics that mattered to her, seeking her input and showing a genuine interest in her life outside of her relationship with Michael. One evening, Margaret invited Na to lunch, extending the invitation with a quiet, almost hesitant humility. Na considered declining, but something in her wanted to give Margaret a chance to see if this new version of her could be real. When they met, Margaret listened as Na spoke about her career, her goals, her dreams. She asked questions not to control or direct, but to understand. "Na," Margaret said softly toward the end of the meal, her eyes filled with a mixture of regret and hope. "I wish I'd taken the time to get to know you like this from the beginning. You're a remarkable woman, and Michael is lucky to have you. I can see that now, and I'm so sorry I couldn't see it sooner." Na's throat tightened at the sincerity in Margaret's words, but she managed a small smile. Thank you, Margaret. I appreciate that. And I hope we can continue to move forward. I think we both deserve that chance. Margaret's face softened, and she reached across the table, giving Na's hand a gentle squeeze. We do, Na. And I'm grateful that you're willing to give me that chance. Months passed, and slowly their family dynamic began to shift in ways Na hadn't thought possible. Margaret and Robert became regular visitors to their home, joining them for casual dinners and spending time together without the tensions of the past. Margaret respected the boundaries they'd set, and over time, Na found herself softening, her heart opening bit by bit to the possibility of a new kind of relationship. One summer evening, as they sat together in the backyard, Na found herself laughing alongside Margaret over a shared joke. Michael watched them with a soft smile, his eyes reflecting a deep contentment. Na caught his gaze and felt a wave of gratitude, a sense of wholeness she hadn't realized she'd missed. Later that night, as she and Michael prepared for bed, Na looked at him, her heart filled with a quiet joy. I never thought we'd get here, she whispered, nestling into his arms. After everything we went through, it feels like a miracle. Michael wrapped his arms around her, his voice filled with pride and love. We got here because of you, Na. Your strength, your forgiveness. It's what made this possible. Na smiled, feeling a warmth she couldn't quite put into words. And your love, Michael. We wouldn't have made it without that. They held each other in silence, savoring the peace they'd fought so hard to achieve. They knew there would be challenges ahead, moments when the scars of the past might resurface, but they were no longer bound by fear or resentment. They had faced the darkness together and emerged into a brighter, more hopeful future. As they drifted off to sleep, Na felt a sense of completeness she hadn't known was possible. Their love had been tested, forged through trials that could have torn them apart, but it had survived, becoming something even more beautiful. And as she lay beside Michael, she knew that no matter what challenges life brought, they would face them together, with hearts open and unbreakable.